Thank you for joining us today. I'm Victoria Leung, co-head of events of the Harvard Club of the UK. HCUK is the umbrella organization for college graduates and alumni for all the Harvard graduate schools. Our club and the Graduate School of Design Alumni Council are honored to host Mr. Sameh Wahba from the World Bank. This is one of the very first virtual events hosted by the club, and the topic is particularly relevant. Special thanks to Earle Arney from the GSD Alumni Council for making this possible. Earle will introduce Mr. Wahba and moderate the Q&A session after the presentation. Please post your questions by using the Zoom Q&A feature at any time. I'll now turn it over to Earle. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And thank you to the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom for hosting this event and making it possible. As Vicky mentioned, I'm Earle Arney, the UK's representative of the Graduate School of Design's Alumni Council, and it's my pleasure to be your co-host today. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation, Cities and Contagion, COVID-19's implication for the urban poor. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, just a few housekeeping matters just to amplify those that Vicky mentioned. We wish to make this session as interactive as possible, so the formal presentation will be approximately 20 minutes, and then will be followed by a discussion informed by your questions. We encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by typing them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. And after the presentation, we'll begin the discussion portion of the webinar, and I'll do my best to have all your questions answered. Cities and Contagion, COVID-19's implication for the urban poor. The COVID-19 global pandemic is an unprecedented threat to every city and community the world over, with far-reaching and profound, prolonged impacts on everything from public health to global supply chains and the global economy. Cities are on the front line in preventing the spread of the virus, while at the same time spearheading emergency economic recovery efforts to protect the livelihoods of their communities. Yet 1 billion people live in informal settlements across the developing world, lacking basic services and infrastructure, especially for hygiene and medical care, with a reliance on communal facilities, making social distancing unfeasible, only accelerating infection rates and compounding the difficulties of responding to the virus. Here to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on cities and the urban poor, alongside immediate, short and medium-term priorities for action as how cities might fare post-pandemic, is Sameh Wahba, Global Director for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practice, an alum of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, with a Masters of Urban Planning from '97 and a graduate from the School of Arts and Sciences with a PhD from 2002. Dr. Wahba is an urban specialist with 25 years experience in housing, land, local economic development and urban management and municipal service delivery and post-disaster recovery reconstruction. The global practice he leads has a portfolio of 250 projects with 30 billion US in commitments, provides loans, credits and grants of 6 to 8 billion US per year, and completes about 200 studies per year. Welcome, Sameh.
Thank you very much, Earle, and thanks a lot to both the Harvard Club of the UK and the Harvard Alumni Council for hosting me for this conversation about cities and contagion and the impact that COVID-19 is having on cities and on the urban poor. My presentation is in two parts. The first part will go through the impact that COVID-19 is having on cities and the urban poor and some of the needed actions in the short and medium term. And the second part will look into the city of tomorrow. So basically the recovery and what COVID-19 is likely to entail in terms of the configuration of the cities. So next slide, please. COVID-19 is really having an unprecedented impact on both cities and communities. As you can see on the map, the epidemic is hitting just about every place in our globe. There's only a minor handful of Pacific islands that have not registered COVID cases. And the total number of cases has exceeded the 4.5 million cases, rapidly approaching the 5 million, and the number of deaths is over 300,000. Next slide, please. It is having a deep and multifaceted economic impact of cities. Now, it is foreseen that this will be the worst economic contraction in almost 100 years since the Great Depression. The US alone has registered 36 million cases of unemployment. So there are major job losses all over the world, and particularly quite a bit of impacted livelihoods. Small businesses, supply chains are disrupted. And of course, 90% of the registered cases are in cities. So the impact is particularly heavier on cities. Informal sector workers, of which there's anywhere between 1.6 to 2 billion workers globally, on average, about 60% of labor force, and in certain countries, 90 and 95%, are having a serious hit in terms of their livelihoods because their jobs and incomes are unstable and they don't have safety nets. Our rough estimates at the World Bank suggest that at least 100 million people are going to fall into poverty. Now, in this particular case, we're using macro models and that look at poverty lines in the range of $3.2 a day and upwards, which are the adjusted poverty lines for urban segments. In addition, we estimate that on the poverty line of $1.9 a day, 49 million will be pushed into extreme poverty. In terms of the impact on cities, we've done some analytics on a group of cities, and we estimate that municipal revenues or city revenues are going to decline this year and next year by an average of 15 to 25%. So cities at the same time are facing an unprecedented crisis and are losing anywhere between 15 to 25% of their revenues because of the contraction in economic activities. Next slide, please. Now, the impact is going to be particularly heavy on developing country cities, which have limited capacities and which are also potential hotspots of viral transmission. I mean, these cities have strained resources. They do not usually have preparedness in advance for these types of contagion epidemics. Therefore, their emergency preparedness and response capacity is limited. They also are facing economic contractions, reduction in revenues, and a large number of issues to deal with in terms of the spread of the disease, especially in terms of the unlivability conditions, whether be they poor housing conditions, poor infrastructure, and low livability. Next slide, please. Within cities, the impact on informal settlements and slums is going to be particularly complicated. Now, these are places that lack usually some or all of the following attributes. They do not have secure land and property tenure. Their housing conditions tend to be poor, like you see in that picture. Their infrastructure conditions tend to be lacking, and they tend to not to have public spaces, etc. And oftentimes you find such places in at-risk areas, be they at risk of floods, of landslides, etc. Now, there's an estimated 1 billion people who live in slums and informal settlements. Now, these settlements in general are places where social distancing is unfeasible because there is overcrowding in housing, there's lack of public spaces, etc. That is because of this high population density. And then when you add the limited access to services, health services for one, but also common facilities like water, public water fountains, public toilets, etc. These are also places of contagion. So a large share of the population becomes at risk of contagion. In addition, much of the population in slums and informal settlement tends to work in the informal sector, and therefore their livelihood tends to be at risk because of lockdown policies. Next slide, please. So cities in this regard find themselves at the front line of combating the epidemic. And in this regard, they need to operate in three different phases. An immediate phase, which is the emergency response, and it's predominantly about curbing the transmission of the virus and of the contagion. So taking in place the actions that are needed to curb the transmission of the virus, and also to care for the affected. The affected being those that are affected from a health perspective, with a surge on their health services, and at the same time those that are affected economically because of the lockdown policies, and therefore need to have support in terms of cash transfers, etc. At the same time, cities need to target those that are particularly vulnerable. And this is the vulnerable places, slums and informal settlements, and the vulnerable population, which are the poor, the vulnerable, the elderly, those with prior medical conditions, etc. At the same time, cities need to jumpstart a process of early recovery, especially in particular of jumpstarting the economy, and then preparing for the long-term recovery and what happens at a later stage. So if we break it down into three levels, first to look at the types of targeted actions that need to happen to attend to the most affected populations and places, and then to look at citywide actions, and then we look at the city of tomorrow. Next slide, please. In terms of targeted actions for the poor and the vulnerable, and these again have to come into an immediate intervention, because with lockdown policies, those who are working in the informal settlement, in the informal sector, who have their livelihoods affected, those who are living from hand to mouth, need basically serious interventions in terms of safety nets. So you've got programs that are social safety nets, such as that which the government of Uttar Pradesh in India has introduced, which it is providing workers a compensation because they've lost their jobs and their income, the informal sector workers, rickshaw drivers, food vendors, etc. So cash transfer. Also, Panama is introducing cash transfers to unbanked people, supporting again the poor and the vulnerable. Of course, children in particular are affected, both from an education and nutrition perspective, because children, especially in low-income communities, not only get education at school, they often get the most nutritious meal that they get in any given day. So programs to feed children in low-income communities are being put in place, again, in a variety of countries, as well as there are cities and countries that are expanding Wi-Fi access in poorer neighborhoods, so that children could benefit from the online education, so that it does not come as a double whammy, where they are affected both educationally and nutritionally. Of course, water, sanitation and hygiene programs, what we call WASH programs, are critical. There are places where water is lacking. Hand washing stations that are being set, in front of all public facilities and buses in places like Rwanda, in the slums in Kenya, and of course the production of hand sanitizers, etc. Health services, both electronic health services, but also community-provided health services. And then lastly, which is a major approach to provide support, income support to youth, to poor and affected households, what you call labor-intensive public works. And these are small-scale works that are designed with a high component of labor intensity. So things like, the clearing of debris, the clearing of drainage channels, basically repaving roads with things like cobblestones, small home improvements. And they are the type of programs that are introduced with a cash for work type structure to transfer income against labor contributions. And they are, of course, designed with an important element of gender sensitivity, so that women as well can access such activities. Next slide, please. There are also other programs that are targeted at the poor and vulnerable people, but also in poorer neighborhoods, like social awareness programs, but also measured to target specific vulnerable groups, for instance, migrants, women, children, I mean, for instance, at the World Bank, there's particular attention to places like Cox's Bazar, etc., places where there are refugees, because these tend to be affected and tend to be lacking in services. Next slide, please. From a citywide perspective, I mean, there are efforts to scale up testing to make it more efficient, more low cost. And then there are other efforts, which you see in the picture on the right-hand side, which is a work that the World Bank is doing, which is using artificial intelligence to predict potential hotspot transmissions for the virus. So here what we do is we bring high-resolution satellite imagery from our partnership with the European Space Agency and the German Space Agency, DLR, three-dimensional modeling of the city, and then we bring population density through what you call population grids, and this is a distribution of population density across a city, and we start looking at which neighborhoods in a city could not sustain social distancing on account of their built-up space divided by the population in any particular grid cell, to see whether it can sustain the 3.5 square meters per person, which is basically the equivalent of a circle or a hexagon with a 2-meter radius to allow social distancing between people. This allows us to predict which neighborhoods in a city do not have the built environment that can sustain physical or social distancing. And then we complement this with getting georeferenced data on the ground of where are potential hotspots for contagion. For instance, as I mentioned, public water fountains, public toilets, etc. These are places that are essential amenities, and when people do not have them privately, they have to congregate in public places, and therefore in such places you have an additional vector for transmission. Now we get this data on the ground working with Shack Dwellers International and other organizations representing the urban poor, where we get that georeference data. Combining this data from above with that data from the ground, we can predict which are the places in a city that could be hotspots for transmission of the virus. And we share that information, obviously, very rapidly with mayors so that they can divert their limited resources and focus on the places that could be transmission hotspots. Next slide, please. There are also important interventions that are incumbent on cities in order to be able to put in place measures to reduce, to flatten the curve of the transmission, and also to provide care for the affected. I mean, so cities have to complement national and provincial level facilities for public health, prioritizing the treatment of COVID-19 patients over non-emergency healthcare needs. They often find themselves repurposing public facilities such as stadia and community centers and libraries, etc., so that they can become either shelter for the homeless or quarantine facilities, or even additional health facilities. And then they start regulating public places like open spaces, streets, etc., closures into streets to create much more walkable areas, increased bicycle lanes so that you can allow for the infrastructure for physical distancing, and be able to transform the city to be able to deal with this type of epidemic. They also have to regulate private facilities as well. Next slide, please. So as they regulate private facilities, including the decision of what are essential businesses that could continue, what are non-essential businesses, what are of events need to be closed, etc., to reduce the transmission. They also find themselves as local governments working on effectively managing the supply chains within the city. How does food arrive into the city? How does it reach markets? How does it get distributed? That's critical supply chains for medical equipment, and all sorts of facility. At the same time, cities are doing that with a reduced workforce, because not all workforce is going to be essential. Some of the workforce is going to get affected by the virus. Some people will be of particular groups, such as elderly, etc., that you will want to have less exposure into conditions that might get them infected. So cities will also be redeploying their public resources in terms of human resources and limited financial resources to sustain these functions, and also to maintain other types of complex functions like ambulances, like mortality management, etc. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned, cities are getting also particularly hard hit by the impact of lockdown policies on the contraction of economic activities. That means, as restaurants are closing, as businesses are closing, cities are getting less sales tax revenues, less, and they have to provide relief to certain people, the poor and affected people, maybe providing them with, protections against evictions, maybe relief in terms of payment of property taxation, relief for businesses. So cities find themselves having serious economic contraction. Now, to try to estimate the impact on cities, besides the work that we do on municipal budgets to look at the drop in revenues, one of the work that we do is to get a quick understanding of the economic contraction. We look at night lights data, so basically satellites that capture the intensity of night lights, which becomes a proxy for the intensity of economic activities, of course, for places that are obviously electrified. And we notice, in the images in front of you, you see in the city of Wuhan in China, the difference in the intensity of night lights from the left-hand side, which was in mid-January versus in early February. You'll see the types of, dimming of the lights that is happening. You can also see, so it's a dynamic imaging that helps you complement your understanding of the drop in economic activities. Next slide, please. Now, as cities are implementing all these interventions, citywide interventions, targeted interventions at the poor and the vulnerable, they need to be working with all sorts of governments, national governments, subnational governments. They also need to be working with communities, with research institutes, with the private sector, so that you can have coordinated actions across sectors, but also across jurisdictions. So targeted actions that are also coordinated spatially. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the future of cities under the new normal, let me share with you a few of those issues that will be really important as mayors and local governments think about as their cities start re-emerging from this current situation, both as a cure starts getting found and down the line as a vaccine starts getting found. Next slide, please. The first big question is, what will be the implication in terms of the perception of citizens of density in a post-COVID world? We all know that there are benefits to density and to urbanization. It's the basically agglomeration effects that lead to increased productivity. It's the concentration of jobs. It's the coming together of people with the resulting innovations, knowledge transfer, exchange. It's the ability to provide higher level amenities, more efficient public services. These are the benefits of urbanization. These are among the reasons why people go to cities, obviously, if that urbanization is well managed. But at the same time, there are costs to urbanization. There are costs related to congestion, pollution, crime and violence, unaffordable housing, and of course, with COVID-19, higher likelihood of transmission because of the proximity of people together. Now, to what extent will those two dimensions, interact and weigh in on the future of cities? This will be critical. And what's really interesting is that until we're talking about epidemics, the large majority of the ills of urbanization, which is the negative externalities if urbanization is not well managed, basically they were affecting disproportionately some people more than others. So, if you have, crime and violence in an area, maybe the well-to-do population in a given city could live in gated communities and isolate themselves, or maybe they supplement the policing of their neighborhoods, with, private initiatives, etc. If it's congestion, again, it depends on the mode of travel. You find that the poorer walk or take, informal minibuses to work. There might be more facilities for the rich. So unlike other ills of urbanization that could have affected rich and poor differently, in particular, epidemic, does not discriminate. It's hitting everyone, and the mobility of people within a city means that everybody could be affected. It's true that, if you're rich and you live in a larger house with, better infrastructure, with the ability, to provide, to work from home with broadband connectivity, with the ability to have food delivered, etc., the ability to cope with a lockdown and social and physical distancing policies might be easier, but epidemics hit everyone alike. And therefore, there's much more onus on, improving living conditions in the poorer and more affected areas. Next slide, please. Again, related to this, to what extent will people emerge from this post-COVID world with having changed sociocultural legacies, whether in terms of higher preference for online gatherings, etc., versus the actual face-to-face contact? Again, is a question that will be answered. Next slide, please. Public transit systems will have to adapt significantly into lure their users, their riders in metros, in bus rapid transit, etc. So how will conditions of public transit emerge? And we are starting to see a lot of cities that are transforming basically road space into additional sidewalks to allow more space for people to walk under physical distancing new norms. We're seeing major cities adding bicycle lanes. Bogota alone added 70 kilometers. Auckland is widening the sidewalks. Paris is also closing streets. So, I mean, you're seeing quite a bit of change in the mobility choices. Next slide, please. There'll need to be quite a bit of adjustments in terms of land use planning and zoning. I've mentioned the first imperative, which is the improvement of housing and living conditions in slums and informal settlements, because they are contagion hotspots. Obviously, so in addition to the equity considerations, it's also the public health considerations. But of course, there will be other interventions related to the design parameters of public spaces, sidewalks, open spaces. Abattoirs and wet markets are going to receive particular attention because diseases like the swine flu, SARS, and now COVID-19 have emerged in live animal markets. So the way these facilities are going to be cited, regulated, operated will be receiving lots of scrutiny. Occupancy and crowding thresholds for restaurants, marketplaces, gathering places also will improve. And then the planning of peri-urban areas and the linkages between rural and urban areas will also evolve. Next slide, please. A critical area of intervention of local governments will be a focus on enhancing city preparedness for dealing with emergencies. So emergency preparedness and response. It's the emergency operations centers. It's what capacity they're going to have in place, what human resource deployment and redeployment plans, what business continuity plans, what facility conversion plans they're going to have in place. At many cities, neither had that capacity for disasters from extreme weather events like hurricanes, floods, cyclones, etc., nor for epidemics. Some cities were prepared for the weather events, but lesser so for epidemics, and very few cities had the preparation for both dimensions. Next slide, please. Supply chains might become more localized, in particular food, also energy, to ensure maybe more self-sufficiency for cities. What has resulted significantly is obviously disruptions to food and to more global supply chains. So this is one thing that may evolve quite a bit. And next slide, please. In this, basically, digital infrastructure and digital solutions are also going to evolve. I mean, there'll be definitely expected improvements in global internet bandwidth. There'll be digital fabrication solutions. There'll be global knowledge sharing, hackathons, what have you. And with them, obviously some thinking about the implications in terms of cybersecurity and privacy. Next slide, please. And then lastly, for urban planners and for all city residents, I mean, two trends will have accelerated significantly. It's the future of work and the future of education. Now, obviously, infrastructure, digital connectivity has been progressing, has been allowing improved solutions in terms of telework, the same thing in terms of online education. But obviously, with the COVID-19 crisis, those two dimensions will have taken a major leap forward. So to what extent in a post-COVID world will, if you want, traditional workplaces and traditional educational establishments return to normalcy? Will we see the end of the central business district as we've known it? I think is another very important question. I think, at this stage, I mean, I've, of course, like every one of you, have, my own views, both as a citizen, but maybe from, if you will, from an urban planning perspective, for me, one of the important implications, I think we have been dealing for quite a while with the trajectory of cities and disruptive technologies. The future of work have been evolving. I mean, the asset ownership has been evolving. I mean, we no longer need to own cars. I mean, we can Uber our way into a city. We no longer need to own quite a bit of assets. I mean, Airbnb has changed quite a bit. So I mean, in between, if you will, the sharing economy, the gig economy, telework, and other if you will, technological leaps forward that have been questioning your regular configuration of a city, which is a central business district, residential neighborhoods, proximity between where you work and where you live. All this traditional view of a city was already in a pre-COVID world evolving gradually, and I would expect to see in a post-COVID world these trends accelerating. And if you want me to just deploy for a second my crystal ball, I think the future of cities is going to rely less on that traditional notion of a city as a workplace, or it will be much more about the livability conditions in a city. It means the amenities, it means the culture, the diversity, the walkability, the open spaces, and all other dimensions of a city that are attracting an increasingly footloose and increasingly mobile population. So with that, thank you very much. And next slide. Thanks. Over to you, Earle.
Sameh, thank you very much. That was very informative and interesting. So we have a range of questions. And the first one is a fundamental question, and it is from Steve Watts. And it is a question posing, are our responses to COVID-19 likely to widen or narrow the inequality gap?
Thanks, Earle and Steve. I mean, it's a very, very good question. And I think the short answer is it depends. The way I'm seeing it is if we draw the right lessons from this epidemic, we will know that cities are as weak as the weakest link. And the weakest link in the cities as we know them today are those manifestations of the inequality. So COVID-19 has laid bare those inequalities, and especially when certain poor and vulnerable groups end up finding themselves having to have a trade-off between basically disease or hunger. So you stay at home, lockdown, then you're an informal sector worker unable to earn an income, and therefore it's hunger, or you go out and search for livelihoods, and therefore it's an increased risk of disease. So these inequalities have manifested in the COVID-19. So to what extent will governments, local governments and national government act on this and make it their priority to intervene in the poorer and most deprived neighborhoods in their cities, improving living conditions and creating conditions both for the improvement, the physical improvements in housing and infrastructure, in services and in livelihoods for poor people where they are, but also improving the mobility conditions also of poor people. And that's not just physical improvements in their living environments, but it's also increased opportunities in terms of education, in terms of access to health, and investing in human capital so that they can have the opportunity to break out of the cycle of poverty. So inequalities have appeared, and I would hope that the response to it will be an increased attention to the reduction of inequalities.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Just a reminder too, should you wish to pose any questions, you click on the Q&A button, which is most likely at the bottom of your screen, and we will then field your questions. So Sameh, next question is regarding density, clearly a London question. You've published an article last month titled "Urban Density is Not an Enemy in the Coronavirus Fight," and you cited evidence in China. Now, many in the UK are making a link between a city's density and its vulnerability to pandemics. And New York City is often cited as a reference point by those arguing that density is bad. However, I understand that from what you've said, it's a much more nuanced position. Can you talk about the risks people are the links people are drawing between density and COVID-19 transmission risk?
Thanks, Earle. So the simplistic view has been that cities that are larger or that have higher population density are more prone to contagion. Now, this, as I've mentioned, is a simplistic view because first, you've seen cities that are equally dense, equally large, but that fared very, very differently. I mean, you've seen places like Singapore and Seoul in South Korea that have, you know, control the virus much better than other cities of their size and their high population density. So it's not per se about the density. Obviously, the proximity of people will increase the contagion risk. So it is a factor, but it's not the most important factor. The most important factor is how that density is managed. So it's the difference between density and overcrowding. So if, you know, you've mentioned New York. If you look at New York, you'll find that the different boroughs of New York have fared very, very differently. You'll find that the borough of Manhattan has, you know, much lower infection rates than the average, and you'll find that, you know, boroughs like Bronx and the Queens have much higher infection rates. So within a city, you know, average population density won't really be the factor. So the work that we've done on China, and the reason we've chosen China is that they have gone through the entire cycle of, you know, the peaking of the contagion and then the stabilization and then the decline. And if you put aside, and that's what we did in this analysis, if we've put aside, if you will, the first cluster, which was in Wuhan and the province, which at the time, you know, there were still no, if you will, it was still a novel thing. We've taken the other 284 cities and we've ran basically the relationship between population density and the number of confirmed cases. Now, some people might talk about, you know, is the data, you know, reliable, not reliable? At the end of the day, this is, you know, a study of cities within China. So if there's a bias, it will apply equally to all places. But what was very obvious in it is that the denser places had lower rates of infection per 100,000 population. And so therefore, it was another element of support that it's not per se about density or high population size, but about how that density is managed, meaning places that have poor infrastructure, poor housing conditions, so where the density is translating in overcrowding and poor and unsanitary living conditions, these are the conditions that are helping cities become much more transmission hotspots. Lastly, cities with higher population density or with higher populations, like in that case in the China article, the Beijings and the Shanghais, are capable by virtue of scale of having much more specialized, if you will, medical services, and therefore potentially being able to cope also in a different way than, if you will, the smaller cities. So that's why we wanted to debunk that simplistic view that density equals contagion, and it is to say it's the management of that density is the way the built environment is, you know, not number of people per unit of space. Okay, got it. Now, I've been given a follow-on question here, which says, given your findings unshackling density to the transmission of COVID-19, should we increase the density in London? How much is enough? And is there a tipping point that you are seeing when density comes into play as a factor of city resilience? So that's a harder question to answer. I think, you know, so it first goes back to land markets. So you've got places, that are large conurbations like Sao Paulo, like Mumbai, etc., which we're talking about cities that are in the 15-20 million population range, but which had dysfunctional land markets in the sense that access to land is complicated, but land development regulations are all the more so onerous. So if you find places where you are unable to develop land to its, if you will, maximum potential, given the existing infrastructure, you have an issue. That was the case, for instance, in Mumbai, in Sao Paulo, which have what you call a floor space index or a floor area ratio, which is how much multiples of the land area can you build in a given city. And these are places which had central locations with those multipliers of 1.5 to 2, meaning you can only build twice the area of the land. Or if you build on 50% of the land, you can build 4 floors. Now, the moment you have land development regulations like this, you are, basically distorting the land market and forcing cities to become very sprawling and, expanding over very large surface areas. And this becomes a major trade-off for poor people between livability and opportunity. Because if you are a resident of Nairobi, and half of the residents of Nairobi walk to work, because you walk to work at 4 to 5 kilometers per hour, the number of jobs in the city that they can access in 1 hour of commute is 11% of the jobs in the city. If you take the matatu, which is the informal minibus, because of the congestion and average speeds of 11 kilometers per hour, the most you can access in 1 hour of commuting with that informal minibus is 20% of the jobs in the city. You take London, in 45-minute commute, you can access close to 60% of the jobs in the city. So at the end of the day, a city basically is, from a labor market perspective, so if we don't go into a full stretch telework model, if it's about commuting, you need to have a certain level of density and efficiency, but you also need to have an infrastructure that sustains this density. So for instance, Manhattan has equal population density than the Dharavi, which is the famous slum in Mumbai that was made famous by the Slumdog Millionaire movie. Now, those two places have very different built environments, but they have similar population densities. So the management of that density, again, is what will determine how much density you can carry. If you don't have the infrastructure that can sustain that density, if you don't have the building regulations, and you don't optimize the land market, the resulting will be a flat, spread out, sprawling city that will have major implications in terms of the livability of the city, the productivity, because if you commute 2-3 hours each way to work, like you do in Johannesburg and Rio de Janeiro, you are losing 4 to 6 hours of productivity per day. And then lastly, the amenities and the public spaces that can make that density more livable. So long answer to, that doesn't respond to your London question, but I hope gives you the elements of the answer.
Later, you and I could have a discussion about the Greenbelt, but that could play into it. Now, we have a question here from Stephen, who asks, to what extent are sovereign governments working together across borders to address these issues, sharing ideas, resources, and funds?
I mean, clearly, again, as I've mentioned on epidemics, these transcend physical boundaries, these transcend administrative boundaries, and therefore they require collective action. They require collective action within a city, between local government, the private sector, civil society. They require action across cities, in terms of synchronizing. I live in Washington, D.C., which is part of the so-called DMV area, which is D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. So therefore, you can't really have policies in one jurisdiction not coordinated with policies in the other jurisdictions. But then when you're dealing with a global pandemic such as this one, obviously coordinated action across the globe is particularly critical, not just in finding the cure, not just in sharing experience. So for instance, at the World Bank, together with our colleagues from 100 Resilient Cities, formerly, so the so-called Global Resilient Cities Network, we are hosting a Cities on the Frontline webinar series where we bring mayors, chief resilient officers from a variety of cities to share, the policies that they're doing. I mean, this is totally unprecedented for a very large number of cities, and therefore that sharing of experience has been particularly useful to see what works, what doesn't work, and how can you think of innovative ideas. How can you hedge on municipal finances? How can you better redeploy your resources? What type of policies do you implement in terms of lockdowns? How can you better target, if you will, the more affected neighborhoods like informal settlements, etc.
Okay. Next question comes from Mohammed, who thanks you, Sameh, and his question is, how do you perceive these dynamics playing out in FCVs? What kind of second-order repercussions could take place in fragile cities?
So in context, in FCD context, which is fragility, conflict, and violence places, whether they're nations or within a nation in particular regions that are more fragile, the situation is obviously more exacerbated. It's more exacerbated because there will have been a situation where, because of this fragility, local governments' capacity will be weaker, will be less strengthened, less cemented in place, and therefore the levels of vulnerability are much higher. So obviously there needs to be much more attention in there. We're also talking about places that will have lower, if you will, traditional revenues, whether they're municipal revenues, economic activities, more informality. So take the challenges that we've spoken about and just multiply them a few-fold, and that will be the challenge in FCB places. And because of the fragility in these places, because in many of these places, they could be post-conflict places, they could be in conflict places, the possibility of the exacerbation of conflict and fragility will be much more potentially acute. You will have seen it, especially again, I mean, you will have seen the news in certain, townships in Africa or slums, etc., where, population under strict lockdown policies, and there are attempts at food distribution, whether they're insufficient or there's a lack of food distribution or income support, etc. You will have seen, the instances whereby violence is flaring, etc. So, and again, these are pockets of fragility, maybe within more stable states. So imagine when they affect a larger share of the population and the infrastructure of government and its ability to be present. Now, this said, this is also a moment where social enterprises, basically civil society, and interventions by the private sector are increasing significantly in many of the places to compensate for, if you will, the absence of government or stable and functional government. Okay,
thank you. The next question comes from Tusha, who asks, should longer-term investments be directed to smaller cities to create a new balance in the economic, social, environmental equilibrium, especially as smaller cities are currently more livable just now?
So I think there's no easy answer to this question. Unfortunately, most of the bets that have tried to redistribute population, so an attempt to draw population to, to provide, I don't know, fiscal incentives to convince firms to open up in the more lagging regions, interventions that have looked at growing megalopolis and try to incentivize fiscally or otherwise, or by regulation, people to move to new towns. All these attempts in the past have not succeeded. So those redistributive policies do not simply work. I think what does, because they go usually against the grain of the market. I mean, people move to larger cities for a reason, for economic opportunities, for additional amenities, for seeking education, etc. So what I want to say is it's not a matter of investing in smaller cities as a directed investment because they are more livable. Oftentimes, the secondary and tertiary cities are not more livable. I mean, they're much less livable just because they lack the amenities. And the only thing they might not have is they might not have, if you will, the same large-scale slums that you might see in some of the megalopolis, but at the end of the day, they tend to lack amenities. They lack most of the more specialized services, universities, I don't know, opera houses, museums, this and that, which are part of the compendium of amenities that make the larger primary cities more attractive to certain segments of the population. So I think what I'm trying to say is it is important that you invest, in ensuring that all cities have access to basic services equally, the large and the small alike. Basic services in terms of water, in terms of sanitation coverage, in terms of livability, in terms of a functional commuting patterns, whether it's non-motorized transport like walking, like cycling, or public transportation, and then in, if you will, the major endowments, which are health and education and social protection systems. Once you've ensured all places have these fundamentals, then we can start talking about where the investments in terms of livability can come at a later stage. But I think it's important that you ensure that all places alike have minimum access conditions to infrastructure and services, to address issues like contagion, and to not become a deterrent of population, either moving out. So basically address the push factors of migration, and then the pull factors will be a function of scale.
Okay, that makes sense. The next question is from Edward, who asked a question regarding the environment and energy efficiency. And his question is, to what extent do you think that urban investment in the recovery should be geared to environmental or energy efficiency, i.e. a Green New Deal?
So I think what is critical is, as we think forward in terms of, so we're rightly into somewhere between the emergency and early recovery phases now. So that means public health investments, but also and cash transfers, food distribution, what's needed to stabilize the situation. Early recovery will probably be, as I mentioned, for places such as those that I've been talking about in the presentation, will be things like labor-intensive public works. But as we start thinking in terms of the medium to long-term recovery, then definitely the dimension of sustainability is going to be critical, because otherwise it will be a very missed opportunity if we don't include considerations of environmental sustainability, of climate mitigation, of encouraging energy efficiency, of encouraging greener transport modes, walking, cycling, public spaces, and ensuring that cities are much more livable. So that is definitely going to be critical and needed. And at the same time, as you're thinking about also interventions from a government perspective to encourage the private sector to help, stave the job losses, etc., embedding these dimensions into consideration, adding them as additional incentives will also be critical. Otherwise, because you will all have seen, the comparisons. In other words, in any given year, studies have shown that climate change kills more people than COVID-19. So it is important not to forget that this is also, a challenge of our lifetime, even though obviously we're much more, focused on the health emergency that has crippled the global economy. But in climate change, we have a major challenge that basically will determine the world that we live in. Because an increase beyond, if you will, 1.5 degrees is going to take us into a world that is not going to be, a good place to live, neither for us nor for the generations to come.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Robert, who thanks you for the presentation. And he says, as you touched on, homeless communities in many developed cities are at high risk. Have there been any lessons learned from the management of COVID-19 that may change how we approach helping people out of homelessness in future cities?
So, the responses that we've seen from the cities that we talk to, many of the cities, obviously there's quite a bit of public establishments that are not functional right now, community centers, etc., places of congregation, community centers, stadia, etc., that are being converted either as homeless shelters, again, to reduce the negative impact on such vulnerable population, or as facilities for confinement of affected populations. Now, this, whether it is, what lessons will we extract out of it with regards to the homeless population will be the exact same type of lessons that pertain to the population that's living in slums and informal settlements, because I mean, it is a continuum of insecurity. I mean, whether you have no roof over your head, or you have you live in a zinc shack, but in squatter format, and therefore you do not have secure property tenure, or you might have a little bit of both, or a perception of security of tenure and do not have water and sanitation. This whole continuum of vulnerabilities of housing and living conditions will have to be tackled by cities, because again, as I mentioned, I mean, the city will be as weak as the weakest link. I mean, so it's not only the equity imperative, which has always been there, but maybe, you know, some governments pay attention to it more than others, but also, if you will, the public health and the global public good dimension of improving living conditions in the places that have been left behind is going to become all the more important for both the homeless and the housing insecure and the overcrowded and the housing poor population.
Thank you. Another question, and it's, I'm conscious that you're based in the political capital of the US, and this will require your crystal ball and also your political nous to answer this one. So thank you for your presentation, Sameh. How many years will the global economy be set back as a result of COVID-19, and will the impact be as bad as the recession of 2008? Moreover, how will the UK enforce Brexit given the political landscape is on hold?
Okay, so on the economic crisis globally, we are way past the 2008 crisis. So it is much worse than the 2008 crisis. Maybe, as I mentioned in my presentation, the last crisis of this magnitude, and we could exceed it, is the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I mean, we are in a serious economic contraction, as I've mentioned. From our perspective, I mean, the first models, and again, I mean, these are macro models that estimate certain decline in GDP for a shorter period, and we've estimated there could be 100 million people falling into poverty. So we're talking about, for instance, in Africa, this is the first time there is a economic contraction in Africa in, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And it will be, you know, in terms of the exacerbation of poverty and economic contraction, it is a very, very serious crisis. In terms of Brexit, I'll defer to you and the expert in the subject matter.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. There's a fascinating explanation of how the World Bank is using artificial intelligence to help protect hotspots. The question is, how far has the tech advanced since SARS, and how has that changed the effectiveness of organizations such as yours?
It's been a massive improvement in terms of technological improvements. And there's another presentation that I gave, I think you might have seen it, Earle, the one that has to do with disruptive technologies and the way, you know, we've been using it just in our work in urban and disaster risk management. So, I mean, you will have seen, you know, the work on hotspots. And again, I mean, we've reached such high resolution in terms of satellite imagery, and then when you add it to other methods of, added to radars and other sensors and detectors. One of the things, for instance, we've been able to measure is how many centimeters per year is the ground in the city of Jakarta, Indonesia, sinking every year. You know, and we could show that there are places that are sinking as much as 15 centimeters per year, which is high resolution coupled with radars that are measuring, if you will, the distance from the radar to the ground, you know, and capable of monitoring that. I mean, these are advances that we could never have dreamed of, you know, 5-7 years ago. I mean, you're capable of detecting oil spills in oceans, you know, with satellites. So we have a major partnership with the European Space Agency that has allowed us to really scale up the work of Earth observation. In terms of drones, they provide great cloud-free, low-cost, high-resolution imagery. You know, we could. It took us about 6 months worth of work to map the 2 islands of Zanzibar, when in the 60 previous years we have not been able to map them. You know, and not only that, but we're also training, you know, high school and university kids and graduates, you know, on becoming drone operators, on becoming image processors, etc. So we're creating digital employments as well as a result of these technological advances. Crowdsourcing is a very important function. I mean, we got 20,000 flood points in the span of 3 months. We've mapped half of the city of Dar es Salaam, all the flooding points in the city, with crowdsourcing from the community, working with Shack Dwellers International in their initiative of Know Your City. I mean, informal settlements and slums in many cities which used to appear as a blur on the map are getting actually mapped, and you know, the streets and the landmarks are getting designated. So there's major work. We have a program called Resilient Housing Retrofit that combines image from drones together with image that are captured by a camera that's mounted on a car to create a 3-dimensional image of the city. And then we run an artificial intelligence algorithm to figure out which of those buildings looks to be structurally compromised and could collapse under an earthquake or under a cyclone. And that's, you know, by looking at the porosity and the beams and the type of construction. And then when we ran those things, we've done it in 2 cities. We're talking about medium-sized cities, you know, 500,000. We've mapped the city in less than 3 weeks, and then we send the engineers to look on the ground to make their assessment of the structural integrity of the building, and we discovered we have an accuracy rate of 80 to 90%. So again, it's not going to make decision on a house-by-house basis, but it can tell you this is a risk area, and you can start thinking about. So I mean, it's been a world transformation in terms of artificial intelligence and how it can help our work in terms of urban development and disaster risk management.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're at time, but for a 1-minute answer, a final question that we have from Kat. And she asked, despite the terrible human cost of the pandemic, do you think that a ray of hope is that there is an opportunity to reinvent our cities and to develop a better and sustainable relationship with the natural world? Not a bad one to end on, perhaps.
I agree with Kat. I'm an optimist. I think cities will come out of this reinvigorated, rethought, you know, more walkable, more cyclable, with more open spaces, with more localized supply chain of food, you know, with focus on open spaces, on livability. I would hope, you know, the improvements in terms of telework will, you know, decongest, you know, cities, will put a premium on livability. And for me, what will reinvent our cities is not just going to be the environmental sustainability that will be pursued, but it will also be culture, inclusion, and diversity. So it will be a more inclusive, a more diverse, a more equitable, and a more environmentally sustainable city that will be the city that will make it into the future.
Okay, thank you. Regretfully, we're out of time. We didn't get through all the questions, but we will see if we can impose on Sameh, and we will come back through the website to see whether we can have some of those outstanding questions answered. Now, thank you, Sameh. We understand that this is an incredible busy time for you, and we're privileged to hear your frontline insights in how we battle the pandemic and the implications, particularly for those less fortunate. And it's an honor to host you, and on behalf of the Graduate School of Design Alumni Council and the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom, we thank you very, very much. And we thank all of you for joining us, and thank you for your questions. Now that ends today's presentation. but please look out for forthcoming events that will be posted on the club's website. Many, many thanks, Sameh.
Thank you, Earle. Thank you, Vicky. Thanks to the GSD Alumni Council and the Harvard Club of the UK. And thanks to Britt, who was behind the scene powering off this whole event.
Indeed.
And thanks to all those who took the time to participate.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Stay safe.